At a humid Charleston dinner, Mom raised her glass and told me I'd never have a place in Dad's company. The roast beef went cold before anyone breathed. Names Silas Darden, 55. Internal controller still hearing the ceiling fan hum above and seeing Dad's old leather ledger intact on the shelf. Ever had a moment when family drew the line and you wondered if you'd cross it? The cicadas outside were still buzzing when we sat down for dinner, their drones spilling through the screens of the old dining room windows. Spanish moss swayed lazily from the oak trees in the yard, framing the night in soft shadows. Inside, the ceiling fan clicked in its slow, hypnotic rhythm, stirring the heavy August air. The roast beef sat on its platter, steam curling faintly, though the smell had already begun to fade, as if even it knew the heat of the room had little to do with temperature. Mom lifted her glass first. She always did, with that quiet authority she carried like perfume, invisible but inescapable. Her rings glittered against the stem of her crystal goblet. She held her posture perfectly straight, chin tipped, with the confidence of a woman who had shepherded a company through storms I was only beginning to understand. Her voice, though, carried no toast. "You'll never have a place in your father's company," she said, eyes fixed on me. The room went still. Even the fan seemed to hesitate before creaking forward again. My fork hovered above my plate roast, cooling, while the words lodged themselves like stones in my throat. Naomi shifted in her chair, her eyes darting toward me and then away as though she'd been caught watching a private disaster. Crispin leaned back, smirk half hidden behind his glass of Cabernet, the curve of his lips making clear he'd known this pronouncement was coming. I swallowed hard, managing to curve my mouth into something resembling a smile. The ledger on the bookshelf caught my attention. Dad's old leather-bound volume, the one he used to guide me through my first balance sheets, patient as a tutor and proud as a father. The worn edges and dark patina seemed to anchor me, reminding me that memory carried its own kind of authority, even when living voices tried to erase it. Dinner had begun pleasantly enough. There were stories of Dad's early years, how he'd bargained for office furniture from a failed bank, how he insisted on paying employees before himself during lean seasons. The laughter was real. For a moment my chest warming at the sound of his legacy floating between us. Then Mom's words sliced the table in two. What followed wasn't silence so much as an uneasy vacuum. Knives scraped porcelain. Someone coughed into their napkin. The grandfather clock ticked like a gavel between us. I considered leaving chair legs screeching against the floor as I imagined standing coat thrown over my arm retreating into the humid Charleston night. But my hand tightened around the fork, instead, knuckles whitening. I forced myself to stay, to sit with the humiliation like a discipline. Let them think I was harmless, too stunned to respond. Inside, though, every detail etched itself into my mind, the smug gleam in Crispin's eyes, the stiffness in Naomi's shoulders, the way Mom's jeweled fingers clamped tighter around her glass, as if daring me to contradict her. I chewed slowly, tasting nothing. Across the table, Crispin's phone buzzed once. He slid it face down against the mahogany surface, but not before a thin red light blinked a heartbeat in plastic and glass, pulsing with some secret I wasn't meant to see. And I told myself in that moment that though I had been publicly written out of my father's story, I would not vanish. Not tonight. Not ever. The air in the office still smelled the way I remembered it. Burnt coffee from a pot left too long on the warmer floor polish, faintly masking damp wood, a heaviness that clung to the drapes. A year had passed since that dinner-table proclamation, Yet here I was, stepping back into Darden and Coney as internal controller. My footsteps echoed on the old pine floorboards. Dad's portrait hung above the reception desk, his grey suit, sharp, his smile caught forever in a moment, before the weight of the company hardened him. I wondered, not for the first time, whether he would have approved of me being back at this desk, or whether he would have joined Mom in her silent dismissal. On my desk lay a stack of pension reports, columns of numbers in neat rows. At first glance, everything balanced tidy as any accountant would hope. But my eye snagged on a misaligned figure in the September statement. A single column shifted out of place. Not much a sliver, really, the sort of thing most would dismiss as a formatting error. But it reminded me of Dad saying numbers don't lie. People do. He'd repeat it whenever he taught me to reconcile a stubborn sheet. That small misprint tightened something in my chest. I flipped further. Withdrawals, tiny, almost unnoticeable, spread across several months. Not enough to raise alarms alone, but together they formed a pattern like an itch hidden under the skin. Someone had been siphoning carefully, methodically. I penciled a discreet mark in the margin, noting dates, resisting the urge to circle too boldly. The junior accountants passed by my door, chattering about a weekend barbecue, completely unaware of what these neat rows might mean. Their laughter faded down the corridor, leaving me with the hum of the ceiling fan and the soft crinkle of paper. My gaze drifted to the far corner of the office. Dad's old cabinet sat there, brass handle dulled with time. I hadn't opened it since before his illness. My fingers trembled slightly as I turned the key, a relic I'd kept hidden in my desk drawer. Inside, tucked neatly among yellowing folders, was the ledger, the same one I'd spotted on the bookshelf that night, now sealed away. Dust coated its spine, the embossed initials TD still firm against the cracked leather. I brushed a thin layer away, leaving streaks on my fingertips. That was when the door clicked open. Crispin strolled in navy suit, pressed sharp tie knotted too perfectly for a Tuesday morning. He smelled of cedar cologne, the kind that lingered just long enough to remind you he'd been there. His smile was too wide, his tone syrupy. "Silas," he said, drawing out my name as though it amused him. "Back in the saddle already? Good for you." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. He leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "Careful with what you dig through?" he added lightly, glancing at the papers on my desk. "In this company, loyalty matters more than curiosity." His words slid across the room like oil on water. I placed the ledger gently back inside the cabinet, closing it with a soft click. My thumb lingered over the initials, tracing them once before pulling away. "Just reviewing routine reports," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. He stepped closer, lowering his voice until only I could hear. "Don't dig too deep, Silas. Some expenses are above your pay grade." His breath smelled faintly of mint and bourbon, though it was barely noon. The weight of his presence pressed against me as though he were daring me to flinch. I didn't. I simply straightened a stack of papers, letting the silence answer for me. Inside, though, my resolve hardened. The ledger was still intact, still here, and so was I. The cafe's windows fogged easily in January, blurring the line between the cold harbor outside and the smoky warmth within. It sat on the edge of the pier walls, hung with Rotary Club photographs, frames crooked from decades of salt air. The place smelled of burnt wood and sea brine, a combination so Charleston it clung to the wool of my coat. I had chosen the corner booth, the one with a view of the gulls wheeling over the water, when I saw him shuffle in. Harlan Price had aged since Dad's funeral. His hair, once dark as ink, was now a chalky white, his shoulders rounded beneath a weathered tweed coat. Still, he carried himself with a quiet authority, the kind that came from a lifetime of watching numbers bend to men's ambitions and then break them. He slid into the seat across from me, the vinyl squeaking, and set his hat on the table. "You look like your father when you frown," he said by way of greeting. His voice was gravel softened by patience. I tried a smile, though the truth was my chest felt heavy. "I've been looking through reports," I said, "and something doesn't add up." The waitress dropped off 2 mugs of coffee steam rising in tight spirals. Harlan wrapped his hands around his cup as if absorbing the heat straight into his bones. "Your father always said the pension was the backbone," he murmured. "Not a bargaining chip. He protected it once when the company nearly folded." "That fund is sacred, Silas. If someone is tampering with it now, you'd better be certain." I leaned in. "You think it's happening?" He sighed, then pulled a folded memo from his coat pocket. The edges were creased ink smudged by fingers. "ERISA compliance files don't match the quarterly statements. Withdrawals are being masked, small cuts, but repeated." My pulse quickened. I thought of the ledger locked in Dad's cabinet, the dust I'd brushed from his initials. So I need to compare his notes with what's filed electronically now. "That ledger will tell you more than any server," Harlan said, his eyes narrowing. "If the numbers are true, 500,000 is gone." The words hung between us like the gulls circling above the harbor. Sharp cries muffled through glass. I gripped my mug tighter, the heat biting at my palms. The bell over the cafe door jingled, and Naomi walked in. Scarf wound high against her chin. She paused when she spotted us. Her eyes darted away almost immediately, her step quickening toward the counter. I raised a hand in greeting, but she only muttered, "Don't drag me into this," before disappearing through the door again with her coffee, her hand trembling against the fabric of her scarf. Harlan watched her leave, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned forward, lowering his voice until it was nearly a whisper. "Silas, if you choose this path, there's no going back. Numbers tell the truth, but people will hate you for showing it." Before I could answer, my phone buzzed against the table. An anonymous email subject line blinked up at me. "Check pension transfers 2019. I stared at it, heart thudding. Outside, a gull shrieked against the wind, and for the first time I felt the cold pierce through the cafe's warmth. Rain traced crooked rivers down the office windows, tapping a restless rhythm against the glass as I switched on the fluorescent light. The room hummed with that brittle buzz unique to fixtures that should have been replaced years ago. It was April 2020, and the building felt emptier than usual, as if it too had learned to keep secrets. The smell of bourbon still lingered faintly in my memory. Crispin had pressed a glass into my hand the night before, his voice oiled with charm as he said, "The board prefers harmony, not watchdogs." Now harmony was the last thing I felt. I unlocked Dad's old cabinet and pulled the ledger free. The leather cover was cool and stiff beneath my fingers, its surface mottled from decades of use. But as I opened it, something was wrong. Entire pages no longer bore the rough texture of paper Dad had scribbled across with fountain pens. Instead, they shone slickly under the harsh fluorescent glow. Photocopies. Glossy, too smooth edges, machine cut. The numbers looked right at a glance, but in the margins I could see telltale distortions, shadows of staples, faint printer streaks. My chest tightened. Someone had replaced sections of the book. Not to hide mistakes, but to construct them. In these counterfeit pages, I was the negligent one, Authorization lines traced with my initials withdrawals tied to my department, as if I had siphoned funds under the company's nose. It was a portrait painted carefully in ink that was never mine. The office was silent except for the rain and the hum of the light. Yet I felt watched. Crispin's cologne seemed to hang faintly in the air as though he'd just passed through. When I looked up, I caught a glimpse of Naomi in the hallway. Her lips were pressed tight, eyes lowered. She hesitated only a second before walking quickly away, shoulders hunched, leaving the scent of her lavender perfume behind. I slid one authentic torn page free from the back of the ledger. Dad's handwriting sprawled across it, uneven and real proof of what had once been. I folded it carefully and tucked it inside my coat pocket. Then with deliberate calm, I closed the ledger and returned the forged sheets to their place. Better to leave the counterfeit intact for now. If Crispin suspected I knew the game would be over before I could set the pieces. As I lifted the ledger, it felt heavier in my hands than ever before, no longer just a relic of heritage, but a weapon scarred and dangerous. My reflection stared back at me in the office glass jaw-set eyes lined by sleepless nights. Quiet, but not broken. I placed the book back in the cabinet and locked it. My hand lingered on the key just as a faint glow caught my eye. Above the door, the office security camera blinked. A red light pulsed once, steady and unblinking, recording. Had I just been caught touching the ledger? The rain drummed harder against the glass, as though the night itself demanded an answer I didn't yet have. By October the marsh turned that late-season gold, and the cicadas kept up a stubborn chorus long after the sun slipped behind the river. I worked with the window cracked an inch, letting the salt air mix with the warm breath of the desk lamp. My home office was small, just a warped pine desk, a metal filing cabinet that rasped when it opened, and a printer that coughed like an old smoker before it settled into its whir. Nights weren't for resting anymore. They were for building something that could stand in a room full of doubters and not blink. I cleared a rectangle on the desk with my forearm and laid out the pieces I'd gathered, the photographs of Dad's ledger pages. I'd already taken the lists of transfers, the notes I kept on index cards, because pen scratches stay honest. I slid fresh batteries into a handheld scanner, the plastic creaking in my grip, and lined up the next page under its blue eye. The machine purred across the leather-bound sheet light, fanning slowly, as if blessing the numbers with a second life. Dad's voice has a way of arriving when the room is quiet. Never argue feelings when you can argue numbers. It was how he taught me to still a room without raising my voice, with a total. Here, a footnote. There, a column that reconciles when ego refuses to. I mouthed the words as the scanner reached the margin where his initials TD looped like a signature on the side of a ship. The phone lit up Harlan Price. "You're pacing in your head," he said. No greeting, just the weathered warmth of a man who'd seen boardrooms swing on a decimal. "Only around the edges," I said. "I'm scanning the authentic pages, tagging them with dates. I'll crosswalk them to the quarterly reports." "Good." Harlan replied, the clink of his mug audible through the line. "Silas, you need 3 layers. Originals photographed with timestamps, electronic copies exported directly from the system, and a chain who had physical access and when." "I've got the access logs from facilities," I said. "Badges used after hours. Guess who keeps turning up the week those bogus withdrawals posted?" "Crispin," he said, without a question mark. "And an outside counsel who isn't on retainer," I added. Security camera caught them in the lobby. No sound. But the timestamps line up with the first altered ledger page. Download that footage and mirror it, Harlan said. 2 copies in the cloud. 1 on a drive you keep on your person. And Silas, keep your hands clean. Don't give them an easy counterclaim. The printer wheezed, then spit out another page. I wrote a small A1 in pencil at the bottom corner, a breadcrumb back to the original, in case anyone tried to argue I'd staged my own proof. The desk lamp buzzed, dimmed, then steadied. A bead of sweat slid down my temple, and I wiped it with the back of my hand, leaving a faint streak on the manila envelope. I opened the company portal on my laptop and navigated to the security camera archive, the interface clumsy and outdated. A grainy thumbnail loaded Crispin's shoulders, squared in his navy suit entering the lobby with a tall man carrying a leather briefcase. I clicked to enlarge. The lawyer wore a neat beard and a guarded expression, the kind of face that sells reassurance by the quarter hour. Another angle flickered. Crispin, leaning in head-cocked lips, pressed into his best imitation of concern. He pointed toward the elevator bank. The timestamp in the corner matched the day the forged ledger pages first appeared. I downloaded the clip, then another, then another. A progress bar crept along patient as tide. When each file finished, I renamed it with the date and camera number, then uploaded duplicates to a private cloud folder and a second drive. Belt and suspenders. Harlan's way. My way now. Talk me through your structure, Harlan said after a quiet minute, as if he'd heard the clicks through the line. Layer 1. Photographs of Dad's original handwriting with today's timestamps, I said, pacing the room with the phone pressed to my shoulder. Layer 2, the doctored ledger pages captured as they appear now. Layer 3, the electronic 401k withdrawals pulled directly from the system with the user IDs who approved them. And your narrative, he asked. I don't start with blame, I said. I start with the pension fund itself, Dad's principal. Then I show the timeline original data, the point of divergence, the fabrication. I finish with the compliance memos the board never saw. Good, Harlan said. Paper rustled on his end. One more thing. Schedule send an email with all the attachments to 2 trustees who still respect your father. Set it for the morning of the meeting. If someone corners you in the room, the truth is already walking in on its own 2 legs. I turned back to the desk. The printer, as if on cue, snapped into motion again. I printed the access log page that showed Crispin's badge pinging the door at 10:47 p.m., 3 days in a row. I printed the compliance memo I'd found buried behind an innocuous subject line, year-end pension review, no action required, despite a footnote calling out anomalies. Then I printed the still image from the lobby camera, where the lawyer's briefcase was half open as they waited for the elevator. On a legal pad, I wrote a skeleton of the case in 3 columns. What happened, how we know why it matters. Under that last line, I wrote Dad's phrase in small letters. Numbers don't lie. People do. The clock on my wall ticked toward midnight. Out in the yard, the cicadas pitched their song a half-step higher like a chorus that refused to tire. I slid the printed pages into a thick envelope until it bulged, the flap barely closing. I pressed my palm flat across it and felt the texture rise beneath my skin. Staples paperclip's edges. Evidence has a weight all its own, Silas Harlan said quietly. You know this won't end with applause. I'm not looking for applause, I said. I'm looking for the floor to stop shifting. He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. Then give them ground to stand on. We hung up. I drafted the email. Subject pension fund documentation for board meeting. I wrote plainly avoiding adjectives like a man stepping over loose boards. I attached the ledger photos, the exported transaction logs, the compliance memo, the access log, and the clips. My cursor hovered over more options. I clicked Schedule Send and set it for 8:00 a.m. on the morning of the meeting. Insurance, like Harlan said, truth that could walk in without me if it had to. I backed everything up again. Local drive cloud mirror, a copy burned to a tiny USB I taped under the desk drawer with blue painter's tape. Overcautious, maybe, but the last year had taught me that if a thing could be misplaced, it would be, and then blamed on the nearest convenient fool. I stood and stretched my back until it popped. The desk lamp made a faint ticking sound as the heat settled into the shade. The room smelled like warm electronics and old paper, a scent I'd come to associate with the kind of faith that's more stubborn than hopeful. I stepped to the window. The street was empty. Spanish moss drifted under the streetlight as if someone were combing it with invisible fingers. My phone buzzed against the blotter. A single text. Crispin. Board meets next week. Mom says this time it's final. I stared at the message, the blue light laying a thin line across my knuckles. Final. He wanted me to hear the door closing before I'd even reached it. I set the phone down face up. Then I slid the envelope into my briefcase and clicked the latches shut. 2 small certain sounds in a night that had grown too quiet for anything but resolve. December in Charleston carries a cold that doesn't announce itself with snow, but with a damp weight in the air creeping into joints and stiffening ties. The headquarters boardroom was already heavy before a single word was spoken. Mahogany, polished to a mirror gleam, stretched the length of the room, lined with 12 chairs each, filled by a director whose eyes tracked every twitch and breath. Above us, portraits of past CEOs gazed down stern and sepia-toned like witnesses called from another century. Mom sat near the head of the table, posture regal, a diamond bracelet, catching the fluorescent light with each careful movement. Crispin hovered to her right, navy suit pressed sharp. His smile tilted with the satisfaction of a man who'd rehearsed victory. I sat opposite them, calm on the surface, but with my hand resting on the spine of Dad's leather ledger inside my bag. Its worn edges felt less like a relic now and more like a blade waiting to be drawn. Laureen began, her voice smooth and confident. "Gentlemen, the stewardship of this company requires prudence. Unfortunately, my son has demonstrated negligence that puts us all at risk. The pension fund, a sacred trust, is compromised under his watch." She gestured toward Crispin, who flicked a remote. The projector came alive with charts, bright bars, and plunging lines. "These are the numbers," Crispin said, voice silk wrapped around a noose. "Transfers signed off under Silas's credentials. Withdrawals timed with his oversight. It's all here." His slides scrolled with manufactured precision arrows in red stabbing downward. A murmur ran through half the table. I stayed seated, hands folded until the right silence settled. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out the ledger. The sound of leather against canvas was small but enough to turn heads. I opened it slowly, laid it flat on the table. The authentic page I'd preserved, Dad's handwriting curling in loops no printer could counterfeit, stared back at the room. "These are the numbers," I said evenly. "Not doctored charts, not glossy photocopies. My father's record. Dates, amounts reconciled by his hand." I passed copies down the line, photographs I'd tagged and time-stamped. Beside them, I laid out compliance memos the board had never been shown the ones that flagged anomalies buried in reports Crispin signed off. I clicked my own remote. The screen flickered to life with the lobby camera footage, Crispin meeting an outside lawyer late at night, briefcase cracked open, timestamps glowing in the corner. Then the access logs, his badge pinging after hours, again and again. Crispin shifted in his chair, jaw tightening. Mom's bracelet trembled as she smoothed her sleeve. "Your manufacturing conspiracy." Crispin snapped, his polished voice cracking around the edges. Before I could answer, Harlan cleared his throat. The sound cut sharper than any gavel. He rose, papers in hand, and spoke in his gravel calm. "I served this company as CFO for 30 years. I've reviewed these originals with my own eyes. The handwriting is Thomas Darden's. The figures reconcile with third-party records. What Silas has presented is authentic." The air thickened. Naomi leaned forward, voice barely above a whisper, but loud enough to cut through the quiet. "He's telling the truth." Her eyes darted to Mom's, then fell back to her lap. Silence followed, stretching taut, broken only by the projector fan whirring and the faint scratch of a pen as the board chair jotted a note. He looked up, face stern but steady. The numbers were altered, he said. Each word landed with the weight of finality. "We will vote now." The gavel struck the table, a sound that reverberated through the polished wood and into my chest. Pens scratched across ballots, a chorus of quiet judgment. Overhead, the projector flickered, casting shifting shadows across Mom's still face. And I sat with the ledger before me, scarred but whole, as the board prepared to decide which legacy the company would choose to follow. March brought azaleas back to Charleston blossoms, tumbling pink and white against the damp air, as if the city wanted to remind us that things could bloom again after frost. I stood in the CFO's office, Dad's office once, and brushed my hand across a stack of boxes. Dust lifted in the early light like a curtain rising on a stage I hadn't chosen but couldn't walk away from. The ledger lay open across the desk, its worn spine creaking as Harlan and I flattened each genuine page, one by one, reassembling the truth piece by piece. "You can't just reveal a wound," Harlan said, aligning 2 sheets with deliberate hands. "You've got to stitch it. Otherwise it festers." His voice had that calm authority that once steadied entire boardrooms and now steadied me. By mid-morning, the conference room filled with employees' faces I'd known since my 20s, others fresh and wary. I didn't bring charts or grand speeches, just copies of the corrected pension statements, each page heavy with clarity. The overhead lights buzzed, but the louder sound was the shuffle of paper as men and women leafed through their accounts, seeing where their money stood. "I won't argue feelings," I told them, "but I will argue numbers. These are yours intact, and they'll remain visible to you from now on." Some nodded cautious relief in their eyes. A few looked down, still bruised by the betrayal that had sat in these walls for years. Later, when the room had emptied, Naomi appeared in the doorway. Her mascara was smudged, eyes rimmed red, and she carried herself with the exhaustion of someone who had run out of masks. "I let him speak for me too long," she whispered, fingers clutching the strap of her purse. "I didn't stop it. I didn't even try. I wanted to say 100 things, anger, forgiveness, questions, but what came out was simply, 'You're here now.'" She nodded once, as if that was all the absolution she could bear, then set the ledger carefully on my desk. "It belongs in your hands now," she said. The sound of it touching wood was soft but final, like the close of a chapter that had weighed on her as much as on me. In the afternoon, as the sun tilted and lit the dust still hanging in the office, an envelope arrived. Thick paper embossed with the seal of local community leaders. I slid it open, the scent of ink and paper dust sharp in the air. The letter inside was plain: "Start a fund. Charleston needs it." I held the page, the ledger resting beside me, and felt for the first time that truth wasn't just about exposing what broke. It was about building something that could last. April sunlight streamed through the tall windows of headquarters, gilding the mahogany boardroom in a way I'd never seen before. The same table that once felt like a tribunal now echoed with applause. The board had just voted. My name, CEO, was no longer a distant word or an insult disguised as doubt. It was a fact written into the company's future. I sat still for a breath, absorbing the sound of hands meeting wood and skin, a tide of approval rolling through the room where I had once sat invisible. When the clapping subsided, I rose. The ledger lay on the desk before me, its leather spine repaired with careful stitching, cracks softened with oil. I placed my palm on it, feeling the roughened surface patched yet sturdy, a symbol of scars acknowledged rather than erased. "Today isn't about me," I began, my voice carrying into corners where portraits of past leaders hung. "It's about what we've learned and what we refuse to forget. My father taught me that numbers don't lie, but people can. We've seen both truths proven here. Our duty now is stewardship, not vengeance." Harlan, seated to my left, gave a small nod, his lined face easing into satisfaction. He'd already told me this would be his last meeting, that retirement wasn't surrender, but a handoff. Naomi sat opposite, her eyes steady on mine, not darting away as they once had. Her support was quiet, but this time it was present. I announced the creation of the Thaddeus Legacy Fund, a foundation to safeguard pensions and expand financial literacy among employees. "Every worker deserves to see their future in numbers they can trust," I said. A murmur of assent moved through the room, followed by something deeper hope. That afternoon, the first workshop began in a smaller hall downstairs. Employees filled the chairs, some with pens poised, others simply curious. I spoke not as an executive dictating policy, but as a son recalling lessons at the kitchen table, how Dad had shown me balance sheets beside his leather ledger, explaining that money was less about power than about promises kept. The air smelled faintly of coffee and copier paper, but the energy was different. It felt like renewal. When I finished, there was a pause, and then chairs scraped back as the employees rose together, clapping with a force that went beyond courtesy. One elder director leaned near me as the applause swelled and whispered, "Your father would be proud." I swallowed against the sudden tightness in my throat. Pride wasn't what I had chased. Survival was. But now pride came quietly, like sunlight sliding across worn leather. Later I stepped onto the balcony, the harbor breeze carrying salt air and lifting the edges of my suit. I held the ledger under my arm, its patched spine warm against my side. The city stretched before me, azaleas blooming again, the tide moving in its endless rhythm. "This isn't just mine," I whispered into the wind, letting the salt sting the back of my throat. "It's ours." And for the first time, I believed it. The morning after that vote, I sat in Dad's old chair, with the patched ledger resting solidly under my hand, sunlight spilling across its scarred leather, as if even time could heal. What I carried forward wasn't a title, but a trust that broken things, when mended honestly, can hold stronger than before. Sometimes bridges collapse so we can learn which ones are worth rebuilding. And if you've ever faced a loss, a betrayal, or a silence in your own family, know that the story doesn't have to end there. Renewal waits in places we least expect. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise?